Every Physicist Must Know by Francis T.S. It is time which changes space, but not the universe changing time, from which every realizable hypothesis is a necessary condition, but not sufficient to warrant an application. Since every applicable science must be repeatable, this must be the sufficient condition for a hypothesis to realize an application. Yet every realizable science must be approximated, of which every applicable science is not exact. Nonetheless, our universe is a one and only one consequence in a dynamic subspace. It is impossible to have a duplicate of the same particle, or a set of identical twins of the same person. This must be the reason why our universe does not allow any paradox to exist. Unfortunately, modern physics was mathematically created. For example, Einstein's 4D time-space continuum, which has polluted our modern science for over a century. Although we know our modern science is irrational, but we have opted to follow it. As a score of Nobel laureates of physics have been granted, I wonder how many of them were deserved for this recognition. For instance, if one plunges any of their hypotheses into our time-space, that is temporal, t greater than 0 space, please show me how many of them will survive. This includes Einstein's time-space hypothesis. A simple doctrine to follow. Without a viable tenet, tragic consequences could happen. This is not just a proof of reliability, but could cost a human life. Any conspiracy theory on the death of Zhang, reference 1, is counterproductive to science. Nevertheless, a reason to cause Professor Wang's death must be his science, since he treated Ettore Margiano's hypothesis as an applicable science. But any hypothesis is not a sufficient dogma to warrant an application, for which I see that Zhang did not understand what a hypothesis means. My sympathy to him is that a human life was lost, but not his science has gone with him. Since he had mistreated Maharaja's hypothesis as an applicable science, but these hypotheses are not sufficient to warrant any application. This must be the reason that eventually killed him instead of all the non-constructive conspiracy theories did. Since Zhang was an eloquent speaker, quickly he became a well-known physicist due to his excellent presentations. But they cannot cover up what a real physicist is. Nonetheless, he was a fictitious, convincing science teacher. If one really understands the realizable physics, one can immediately see that he is not, since he has accepted a hypothesis as an applicable science, as for example, Jordan hypothesis. But to qualify a hypothesis to be applicable, firstly it must be shown that the hypothesis is under test must be physically realizable. Secondly, it must be a repeatable science, otherwise it is not applicable. from which we see the Majorana hypothesis has never been tested as a repeatable science. This is precisely why he could not deliver his angel particle that he had sold to the venture capitalists, for which it had costed his life. Since these unconstructive conspiracy theories of his death were not productive to our science, yet if he had submerged Maharaja's hypothesis to our time-space, he would have found it is not an applicable science, from which a physically realizable hypothesis must be the necessary condition, yet it is the repeatability that makes it a sufficient condition to apply. Again, every repeatable science must be approximated. Reference 1 is a link to a YouTube presentation. Limits of experimental proof. Since every experiment can be repeated, for which it must be approximated, but approximated experiments cannot prove the existence of an exact science, that is, a physically realizable consequence, since every physical reality occurs only once within our time-space, that is, our universe, from which it is wrong to use any experimental proof for an exact science. Since an experiment is a physical thing, for example, real mechanics, it responds naturally with time. For example, under certain conditions, an experiment could have exploded since its entropy increased naturally with time. But its response is not meant following the exact expectation by what the experimenters intended. Added, every experiment must be repeatable, for which every experiment is not exact. That is why experimental results must be approximated, since it cannot be repeated, for which an experiment cannot be used to prove the existence of an exact science. For example, one cannot create particles of the same particle or the same model car of the same car. However, it is impossible for mathematically oriented scientists to create a set of identical cars of the same car, but they cannot exist within our universe. Nevertheless, experimental proof must be repeatable. We cannot use approximated experiment to prove the existence of an exact science, that is, a physically reliable or realizable science. For example, every observation needs an amount of energy, delta E, within a section of time, delta T, to make it happen. But it must be the delta T that is ambiguous, affecting the accuracy of the experiment. Why Professor Zhang had to die. The fate of Professor Zhang must be that he had mistakenly treated Ettore Majorana's hypothesis as an applicable science. But a hypothesis is not a sufficient definition to warrant application. Yet, it is a repeatable science that can be used for applications. Nevertheless, most applicable science needs a huge sum of revenue to carry out the research, of which he had raised over $2 billion at Stanford University, which had operated more like a co-opt research entity than a university-type research laboratory, for which his tragic death was primarily due to his science. For example, he was trapped within a non-realizable fantasy science that he assumed real, that is, an angel particle. Any hypothesis must be proven firstly that it is a physically realizable science. Secondly, it must be experimentally tested, that it is repeatable before it can be applied. But neither Zhang had done this, since he had assumed Majorano's hypothesis was an applicable science hypothesis. But a hypothesis is not a sufficient definition to warrant any application. Firstly, one must test that it is a physically realizable hypothesis. Second, every realizable hypothetical science must be repeatable before it warrants an application, for which we see that Zhang had done none of these. Nonetheless, Professor Zhang was a well-recognized physicist in view by a score of prestigious awards. I wonder why a well-known physicist will use a hypothesis to warrant an application, since a hypothesis must first be proven that it exists within our space-time. Secondly, it must follow up with an experiment to find out before we call it an application, from which it must be the Majorano hypothesis that he tried to use that costed his life. Conclusion. In conclusion, I have shown that any hypothesis is not a sufficient condition to call for an application, since we do not know if it is an existenceable hypothetical science. Even if it is an existable science, it must be repeatable, otherwise it cannot be exploited for an application, since every realizable science goes with time. This is precisely why experimental proof cannot be used for the existence of any physically realizable science, since our time-space can harbor one and only one unique consequence which cannot be repeated, that is, everything changes with time. For example, the current moment of yourself goes with time, which cannot be repeated. Since experimental proof is repeatable, then every experimental proof must be approximated. This is precisely the reason why we cannot use experimental proof for the exact science. However, it is possible to prove the existence of any physically realizable science, since mathematical proof is virtual, and it does not exactly involve any physical substance that needs to follow the law of time, for which we see that every hypothesis firstly needs an analytic proof for the existence of the hypothetical science as a necessary condition, and then followed up with another analytic test to see if it is a repeatable science, which is a second necessary condition before it goes to an experimental test. Let me emphasize again, one should not treat a hypothesis as an applicable science that many physicists have committed. For example, Einstein's relativity hypothesis is not a sufficient condition to warrant time travel. If you submerge his relativity hypothesis, quickly you will find out that it cannot even exist within our time-space. Yet why do we keep promoting it? a big question that every theoretical physicist must answer. Thank you.